As I reread the transcripts and re-listened to the recordings of the long interviews that concluded the Text and Teachers pilot study, it was clear that there were a number of tensions in what those teachers were saying. 3 features from what many of the participants said stand out as reflecting what's possible if we were to take hermeneutics and worldview education seriously, rather than the current status quo, at least at secondary school. First is that, irrespective of pupil population, whether in poor or wealthy socioeconomic setting, whether in a faiths-filled or largely nons pupil population, the teachers that taught hermeneutically experienced something different and rich in their classrooms, with a quality that they had not seen before. And this was true even when they were long experienced teachers. 3 had over 15 years each. Given it was on the back of what was just a few hours CPD in hermeneutics, albeit of course with the backgrounds of the teachers in terms of their study and prior expertise, it was striking to see what seemed to be an unlocking experience, a door opening, which one participant used as a phrase to describe what was happening for the students. They had conversations with Year 7s that went deeper than the questions that the Year 11 GCSE exams encourage. Several participants expressed surprise at how pupils of widely differing levels of achievement responded positively to the study of longer texts. This may be because narrative is easier to become familiar with than lists of propositions or quotes. 2 schools found that they could apply the scholarship of sacred text studies, studied for Christian texts, to the study of Muslim sacred texts. They grew in confidence about progression across religions, whilst remaining within a single discipline. That might be a very significant possibility in that it opens up religious and worldview diversity within single disciplinary patterns. I think this shows sacred text study need not be narrow or exclusive, and that this could open up a very significant possibility for the subject. Previous attempts at bringing in external disciplines to the study of religion have often had the consequence of colonizing the content with external concepts and ideas that have the result of converting rather than translating the subject matter. I think that's an error. Or I think that was an error, and I think it leads every worldview into becoming a version of a sort of, kind of liberal or Western view of religion. Previously, in RE, we were presented with a choice between study within a religious tradition, called confessional by some, and study from the objective far, called professional or academic. We need a new way. Study through disciplines, and I think the findings of the Text and Teachers project ask a key question of curriculum writers. Is it time to develop sacred text programs of study that cross 2 or maybe 3 religious traditions, rather than compartmentalizing the different religions, or using themes which owe little to disciplinarity and more to some frame that colonizes the content? A second observation from 3 participants showed a fascinating interplay within students between their personal worldview, institutional worldviews, and academic study. In one case, a Catholic sixth form student had what the RE teacher participant described as an important conversation, as the student was introduced to symbolic meaning and non-literal interpretations, which the Catholic tradition endorses and includes in its approach to hermeneutics with multiple dimensions. And that follows a tradition of the different senses of meaning called the quadriga. The middle teenager had not encountered this before, and the introduction of it proved troubling, as thus far they had assumed literal reading of the Bible, which is actually quite different from that of the tradition that they believe they were a part of. What this describes is a critical engagement within a faith-based approach to the subject. In another school, a participant teacher commented on how children had been introduced in church primary schools only to literal readings of the Bible, and though most of the pupils were not Christian, this coloured their view of all religions' readings of Scripture, such that the introduction to sacred text scholarship in Year 7 came as a surprise, or an innovation. Dr. Carswell has argued repeatedly for the importance of hermeneutical approaches to sacred text study in primary RE classrooms in her multiple publications and projects, with many schools in the UK and Australia. For example, she developed methods of introducing historical critical hermeneutics with 5-year-olds. The kind of hermeneutics she does with primary children, English examinations curricula do not mention specifically until A-level. English education suffers when it's parochial, and we need to lift up our heads up and read the research, and that's why many of the participants engaged with some of the models that Carswell has developed. In a third school, a participant teacher reported that a pupil had gone home after studying hermeneutics and later said to the teacher that they'd opened up and reread their own religion's sacred text, which was of an East Asian religious tradition. This they found was positive. So there was transfer between school curriculum and personal knowing. These examples show how and why the separation between personal and so-called objective can't really stand in how we think about our subject. What is required is a sensitively and professionally managed relationship, not a false segregation. And I suspect many teachers know this full well. Finally, most of the participants also made 2 kinds of observations about GCSEs from their own work on the project. First, they saw that an understanding of the hermeneutic of sacred texts could help their students explain difference, and so write better long answers in evaluation questions that required insight into why differences were present within the religion. This underscores precisely the words of the Commission final report about why the how matters. The pilot study found evidence that a positive gain might come from teaching sacred text scholarship in the current GCSE system. Hermeneutical RE could be good for grades. But the second observation of the participants was what they saw as a significant omission in examination design, which doesn't foreground sacred text scholarship or disciplinarity as something to be specifically included in the specification or recognised in the grading system and question structures. One of the participants said something like, we don't have the RE things, the things that go on that are done in RE lessons in the way other subjects do. And I think that relates to the weakness around disciplinarity, the fact that there aren't a whole series of recognisable activities that are familiarly and frequently practiced that are plugged into the disciplines within our subject. The prioritisation of sources of wisdom and authority is a step forward, but without specific space for the scholarship of sacred text study, practice within the relevant tradition, the real gain will be hard to achieve, and the dangers of an undue influence of proof texting will continue to limit and damage the education of students. The professed multidisciplinarity, which is permitted by the exams and in their documentation, I think is a myth. For question design reveals the non-discipline structure that is rewarded. There is a structure, there is a code to how to sort out your answers, how to structure them, but it's not related to the disciplines. For the moment, it's accidentally the case that students with a more hermeneutical kind of study could show better answers. The participants say that. But it should be hardwired into the fabric of the system, perhaps seen in a light similar to the value of mathematical method, as well as the correct answers. So the Commission final report wish for the how to matter as much as the what in our subject. That's likely to falter without due recognition in examinations. This was a small-scale pilot study, 7 schools, 10 teachers. But it relates to an international field of scholarship with detailed and sustained work in Australia, Europe, the Americas, as well as the UK. I believe the insights I've outlined flow actually from the work of many colleagues in British RE, but demonstrated by the teachers who participated. Now we need to take the next steps in the transformation of our subject. And here are my thoughts about the way forward. In terms of research, we need an expanded scale of study with many cohorts of schools, ideally in different country settings, to test and establish generalizable conclusions for the validity around sacred text study. We need follow-up work to look at the impact on children to find out what changes. Does hermeneutics study change what students can imagine as possible? What happens to their concept of meaning and significance if they encounter multi-dimensional meanings of reality in their classrooms? There's growing evidence that the foundations of broad sacred text scholarship need to be taught and developed in primary schools. It shouldn't be the case that non-literal reading of sacred texts are only introduced in secondary school. This could, for example, dangerously lead to students to conclude that one must choose between science and religion, which is clearly not necessary and incidentally not sustained by the major religions and worldviews involved in English schooling. What happens if we explicitly teach upper primary to read texts for symbolic meaning? How does that affect their attitude towards science-religion questions? I think there should be a reworking of religion and worldviews in Key Stage 3 curricula to allow sacred text scholarship as a discipline to be taught across more than one religion, and that needs to be brought to the relevant curriculum authorities. Certainly this would be needed before any kind of revision of the GCSE is possible. We need to entertain ideas like the subject could look like a study of the Book of Job and the Bhagavad Gita, and a study of the impact that those texts have had on communities today, and maybe culture and wider life too. This needs to be conceivable in English school settings, be it church school, Catholic school, Muslim school, Jewish school, community school or academy. There is a case for looking at what's going on in higher education, both in terms of what's studied in degrees and also what we do in initial teacher education, to develop solid knowledge bases within the profession and appropriate pedagogies that can support the disciplines we want to encourage. I also think there needs to be trialling of new question structures that offer different kinds of analysis, those that foreground hermeneutics rather than see that as an addition or something not mentioned at all, to develop proficiency in novel applications by the students. So it should expand and progress as they develop, expanding in depth and also across an increasing range of content. There are likely to be many teachers already experimenting with suitable possibilities. These need to be identified, examined, refined, described, shared. To achieve all this, I invite teachers, tutors at universities, and officers in positions of authority within the state systems, private publishing houses, and voluntary organisations to join the hermeneutical work that's already it's already been started, I should say, by many colleagues, and practiced, no doubt, in many schools already. We need to forge a hermeneutical vision of worldview education. Thank you.